So I want to present what Jesus actually says. So in Matthew 5, verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. There are many examples of things that Jesus did away with. Yes. There are also many more examples of things that Jesus is upholding. And the core of that is God's law and the prophetic messages of those that came before him. What's up, party people? It is Brad Large back with you again. I'm so excited. I took like a week or two off of recording videos, and I've been doing some study and been studying Jonah and Exodus and a couple other Old Testament things, but it's so refreshing to get back into something that you spent so much time with, and it just reinvigorates me when I read Matthew, because this gospel, it's the gospel that people like to ignore today, because like they like Luke and they like John because Luke's got all the stories, like it's a nice compilation, and John is like the loving gospel, and so that's the one that everybody likes to quote now. But Matthew is the gritty gospel. So thanks, Jews, for that, because it was written for a Jewish audience by Matthew, who's a tax-collecting Jew. It was awesome. So with that, today is section 2 of week 4, which is talking about kingdom obedience and the OGs and the OT, which is my way of saying the prophets and the law and the examples in the Old Testament. There are a lot of OGs there that laid it down and that Jesus talks about here in this section. So with that, we're going to talk about anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, loving your enemies, and judging people. So let's jump into it. I love this section of Matthew because it gives people problems. People have some problem passages in here, and I think it's great. And it's also got one not problem passage that I think a lot of Christians should have a problem with, the way that they use it. But that's neither here nor there for right now. Anyway, so often we hear Christians talk about how Jesus changed everything. In fact, anytime that I'm discussing on Facebook, if I throw my opinion out there, if I talk about this on YouTube comments or anything, somebody says, didn't Jesus say the law's written on your heart and you're just a good person? Didn't Jesus say this? So I want to present what Jesus actually says. So in Matthew 5, verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. There are many examples of things that Jesus did away with. Yes. There are also many more examples of things that Jesus is upholding. And the core of that is God's law and the prophetic messages of those that came before him. Right here. And in fact, most of the prophecies are directly showing what's going to happen when Jesus comes and after Jesus comes. This often leads people to say, Jesus did away with the law and those old laws don't apply anymore. False. Right there. Jesus came to fulfill it, not to abolish them. There are some parts of the law, we can get into that discussion at some point, but this should be a problem passage to anybody that says, Jesus just came to do that. Judge not. You shouldn't judge people. That's not the message of the Bible either. There are obviously parameters of how to lovingly and compassionately judge people. You don't want to be the bullhorn guy on the sidewalk preaching hate. Okay, I was in New York City. I was going through Times Square, and there was a group of like 5 or 6 black dudes on the corner who told me that Jesus told them, I don't think it was Jesus, but that he hated me because I'm white. This was back in like early 2000s. Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets, not abolish them. Not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The law serves a purpose. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. That's an interesting one. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoa. I would expect, this kind of caught me off guard actually when I was reading it, because I would have thought that there would have been a punishment. And maybe there is, and maybe I'm missing it, maybe it's somewhere else in the Bible. But right here it looks like Jesus is actually saying, if you're trying, if you are saved, if you claim salvation in God, and if that salvation has occurred, and you're inheriting the kingdom of heaven, but you're teaching other people to relax the laws, you're going to be least in the kingdom. Later on, we do see that your actions are tied to rewards and punishments in the afterlife. When he talks about the sheep and the goats, he clearly gives a picture of the kingdom where people whose actions are rewarded. So what you do matters. It's not like, but this idea of God being good and this idea of justice is here, but you can't have justice without a law. It's important. What do these sections teach us? So the next sections are on anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, love for your enemies. I'm going to read one just so we can have a starting point. But anger, you have heard that it was said to those of old. So right off the bat, Jesus is saying, you have heard. He's not speaking about the law itself. He's not speaking old-time law, saying you've heard the law. He's saying you've heard the Pharisees say. You've heard religious teachings about this. And it says, so he goes on, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. It's a very interesting thing, and there's two things. One is that if you've ever been angry, then you know you're liable for judgment right now. Think about the weight of this for just a second. Oftentimes we brush past this, but Jesus is literally telling us that if you're angry, you've murdered somebody in your heart, that you are going to face judgment for that. Be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. I mean, so just that being angry is sinful enough. Okay. I'm just saying, that's crazy. It's crazy to think about the weight of these accusations that Jesus is leveling here. I mean, who's going to get out alive? If you haven't been angry, have you been lustful? Same thing. Have you lied? It's not good. Just the weight of this. You've heard it said, but I say. Jesus is showing that the law's good, but incomplete or misunderstood in a lot of cases, and that human sinful nature can't even allow them to see the law for what it is. He isn't saying the law's bad, just that the intent is what matters, right? So he's saying, you've heard it said, but I say. So no one's getting out alive. The weight of this is just unreal. So then he goes on to talk about anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, loving your enemy, all of these things. I mean, if you haven't done one of those things, then are you even living? So he gives the answer to divorce. Unless someone is sexually immoral, it's not okay to get divorced. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What does this look like in our culture today? Divorces run rampant, right? Full disclosure, I've been divorced. This is crazy. I really struggled with understanding this. Jesus is pointing out here that the intent of the law is just misunderstood. He's saying, look, you guys were given all these laws, but the law has been written since creation. God, when he spoke creation into existence, the law coexisted with that. It didn't come around after. God's very nature is what drives the law. And when we get the intent of that, the intent is to glorify God and his created order. When we understand that, then all of a sudden the law starts making a lot more sense in how we don't live up to it and how we need to live up to it. All of these different ways that we get it wrong. So one of the major things the law does is point out how short we fall of the standard. how high the standard is and how low we can even achieve that. We can't achieve it on our own. That's the good news, right? Jesus is allowing the weight of these things to really press in on people before offering them the good news. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 18 have examples of spiritual hypocrisy. And so what examples of spiritual hypocrisy do we see happening today? If you read chapter 6, let's see. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen for them. Have you been on Facebook lately? For then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound a trumpet so people give away. Charity's a big thing for rich people these days. It's everybody trying to, offer up that, or the latest causes, businesses with flags for LGBTQ, alphabet soup, Nazi stuff, and even transgender and the LGBTQ with the plus sign. For what's that plus sign for? They want to be known by the worldly standard. They want to put a pinch of incense on the altar and say, this is okay, and we support these things. They're doing it in a proud manner. What examples? I mean, one of the funniest ones that I've heard, this example of spiritual hypocrisy, is in a lot of pastors. Pastors are humble when they talk about themselves instead of God. So, for instance, if a pastor gets up and says, I've really struggled and I've really been sinful, and my life experience is this, and these people's life experience is this, and you go, man, that guy's so humble. He's talking about himself. He's putting himself out there. Like, we think that because we think from the perspective of self, not from the perspective of God. If they preach the gospel, then they're actually seen as proud. So people that talk about themselves are seen as humble. You live your truth, I'll live mine. This is my experience. That's humility, because you're not imposing yourself on other people. But you're proud if you talk about God's message. If you're a preacher that says this is the word of God and what it means, people go, who do you think you are? How dare you tell me what's right for me, pastor man? So anyways, this idea of humility, it's so funny to me that is an issue where there's spiritual hypocrisy. Homosexuality in affirming churches. To be loving like accepting sin is like, to me it's being loving by not yelling at your kid when they're about to stick a fork in an electrical socket. All right? And it's not about the consequences here. Maybe that's a bad analogy, because it's not necessarily about the consequences, but the consequences and the wages of sin are death. It is not a life-giving thing to live in sin. And we see this around us. The secular culture is increasingly becoming a death cult. It always has been, but it's becoming more and more apparent. The anxiety, suicide rates, depression, all of these different things popping up so much more. It's to be loving is to affirm people in their sin. That's leading to death. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And it's hypocritical. Political activism. We see people using religion and politics together, but having no idea how to justify their positions biblically and or lovingly. This happens on both sides, all right? People misinterpret the Bible for their progressive agenda, or they use specific verses in the Bible out of context, or to uphold their extremely conservative beliefs. I'm not saying that you shouldn't base your politics off the Bible. What I'm saying is you should do it lovingly, compassionately, and you should get it right. Vodi Bakum is a prime example of this with his book Fault Lines. It's just a fantastic take on systemic injustice, social justice, all these different issues that are popping up, and the Christian response. That's a biblical take on it, and I think we have to be very careful about that as Christians, that we are not being hypocritical. We need to have that in check. We need to put our politics in perspective and strive to be gospel-centered. So another one that I came up with, right answers and no application. We live in a world where people are loud on social media but have no practical effect in the world loving people. Hypocritical. We want to be seen. It goes right back. That's actually the example right out of the Bible. I kind of stole it. Don't tell Matthew. What other ways are people hypocritical that you see around? Put in the comments. Put in the comments. What are some ways that people are being hypocritical? Christians, non-Christians? Call it out. It's fun. Trust me. And it goes back to the other video. You might start getting persecuted. You might get people with differing opinions coming after you. Great. I think these things are things we have to talk about as a culture. That's one of the big things that I try to do actually in social media and on YouTube is you'll see some of my other videos. I'm actually actively trying to get those conversations started and ask questions. And sometimes it looks messy and maybe I'm not being as loving as I could. That's true. I pray about that every day. I promise. And I'm trying to get better at it. But that doesn't mean you don't do it. You have to practice to get better at anything. Anything you do, you have to practice to get better at it. So are you practicing being persecuted and loving in the face of that? How is anxiety a faith issue? What do our attitudes about money and possessions and worldly things betray our true loyalties, right? How do you tithe? Do you give money? This is a struggle for a lot of people, especially as in a bad economy and all this. Are you prioritizing God with your time, effort, and money? And if not, what do you do on Sundays besides go to church? Or do you go to multiple churches? I think one of the biggest things that drives me bonkers about younger generation people and people my age, millennials, okay? Pick a church, bro. Pick one. Don't go to a different church every week. Go to the same church every Sunday. If you cannot find a wife, if you're looking to expand your horizon, go to multiple churches. Find find evening church services to go to. Find Bible studies. Find small groups. Get connected in that way and go join those at other churches if that's what you need to do. But every Sunday morning, you should be at the same church building, the same relationships with the same people and building those people up and being a part of a community where you can measure yourself growing and see other people and have consistent mentorship. Boom. That's all. With this secular death cult, one of the biggest issues, I think is somewhere north of 70% of all transgender issues, people that identify as trans. One of the things that is like a huge marker of this is anxiety. It's like upwards of 70 or 80% of all people have at least anxiety and depression. Anxiety is a faith issue. Anxiety is a huge faith issue. We see it all around us. And it goes back to the last thing. Where you put your money, that's where people can tell that that's your priority. Money, time, effort. Anxiety is the same thing. You are putting your faith in things that are destabilizing you if you're anxious all the time. I'm going to disclaimer, there are people with anxiety, depression, and mental issues that should seek therapy, should seek counseling, I'm not saying that those things are bad, but anxiety first and foremost comes from focusing on yourself and not on God. Not on the God that can provide for you. Not setting your foundation on God's firm foundation. That's first and foremost where anxiety comes from. That's my 2 cents. Anxiety is worrying instead of trusting in God. It's that simple. We have record levels of anxiety, depression. At the same time, our culture is not recognizing God's sovereignty and power. Coincidence? I don't think so. Even the people who believe in God tend to think of him as a big guy in the sky, not someone directly and intimately connected with their daily sustenance, not somebody who's actively protecting them, not somebody whose sovereign plan is being acted out in the world right now. So I think it's one of the biggest sins that we aren't talking about is this idea that our posture and mindset is leading us directly to anxiety. All right. Some of the theological themes for this section. Mission impossible, like we talked about, obeying the law. The law points out how deficient we are on purpose. The law should make you feel this big when you recognize you can't live up to it. That's appropriate. This is something that came up recently, I was thinking about people talking about when they approach God, they feel so good. And I went through this where I actually went away from the church for 10 years. And when I came back, I had to face God. And I had an understanding of who God was from growing up in the church. And I didn't think I'd get emotional about this. When I came back, I was in awe of God. I feared him appropriately. You recognize the weight of this. And I don't think that you approach God unaffected. And I think that's why a lot of people turn away from God. It's very uncomfortable to recognize how broken, how small you are compared to a perfect, holy being. If you don't recognize that, I don't know what to tell you. When I came back, it was difficult. Standing in even a little bit of God's light starts to purify you, because you cannot hide sin. When it's God's light shining in your life, nothing is hidden. There's no getting out alive. There's no debating that there's very real punishment for those that cannot uphold the law. Matthew's the least favorite gospel for a lot of people because they don't want to talk about the judgment. They don't want to talk about the punishment. And Matthew is very upfront and clear about that. The hope of the gospel is that Jesus pays the price, though. The sacrifices of the Old Testament, the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, that's done away with. We don't need it. It wasn't working at the time. It was a check we were writing that God never cashed. It couldn't pay the bill. It would overdraw our account. It would destroy us, literally. And Jesus did that. Jesus was destroyed so that we wouldn't have to be. The hope of the gospel is that Jesus always pays the price. Just as the original covenant, God does it all and extends grace to all nations, Jesus fulfills that covenant, that law. We fear the Lord for this very reason. We extend hope and grace to others for this very reason as well, because nobody's getting out alive and nobody's good enough. Jesus came to set the record straight about the law. Anyone who says we're no longer under any law is mistaken. Antinomianism, I think. Lawlessness. There is no law. It's a costly mistake. It's been a heresy in the church ever since the New Testament writers. It's that simple. Paul talks about it all the time. Nope, the law is in effect. God's sovereign plan is still being acted out. Not everything has come to pass. God's sovereign plan is being fulfilled through Jesus. He didn't make a bunch of mistakes that Jesus needed to fix. We did. And so the fulfillment of the law and the prophets points to this glorious story. Because without this law, without this harsh edge, there would be no contrasting God's soft mercy, his grace, his love, with his hard judgment and punishment. Hell. Very real. Punishment's real. Judgment's real. Anyone who reads the gospel and doesn't see it is incredibly blind. It's all over the place. To me, this is ridiculous that people have a hard time accepting this. It is a cup of wrath. The best example of this is actually this old concept of God's wrath being a cup that we drink from. We willingly drink it, and God keeps filling it up. He gives us what we ask for. People say, well, even if there was a heaven, I wouldn't want to be in it. Great, God would give you that. And then you would complain. You'd be like, well, hell is the other option. Yeah, that's reality. That's simply reality, and that's what you ask for. To be separated from God is hell, and that is what you're asking for. Should God not give you what you're asking for? Crime needs punishment. How much more so an act of hubris that leads to immeasurable suffering? This idea that humans are just blameless anyway, we can't even see what's good. We can't see what our impact has. It's like the butterfly flapping its wings. The consequences of our sin are far-reaching, but even if it had no consequence other than separating us from God, it's still sin, even if it only affected us. But we're prideful to think that, we're not self-aware to think that our actions, our sin, affects the world in a negative way. That's crazy. Why do we think we do not deserve justice? I did hear there's the street preacher that goes around on YouTube asking people, and this one guy said, but I've been a pretty good guy my whole life too. And he says, if you went to a court of law and you told the judge, I stole that stuff, but I've been a really good guy the rest of my life, would the judge say, oh, well, if you've been a good guy everywhere else, then this one thing doesn't matter. Stealing thousands of dollars from a store, no big deal. It's not how it works. We understand this when we think about it in real circumstances. But we tend to forget it when it's God. How much pride do we need to think that God owes us anything? So that's what I've got for section 2. Like and subscribe. Check all these videos out. Put in the comments what you thought about this section. If it spoke to you, how you thought about it, if it was good. And with that, we'll jump into section 3. All right. Peace. Section 3. Peace.